Welcome back to another Reddit readings video. Sit back, relax, and enjoy these personal creepy stories. Never approach your own voice. Come here, girl, the same line I used to tell my dog to greet me home after a long day of school. That same comforting and warm line suddenly became one I disdained as I heard my voice from the attic calling out, "Come here, girl." I've never been the one that believes in the supernatural and unexplained, so I just thought it was someone near our house that had a similar voice and paid no mind to it afterwards. Until my roommate asked me why I was playing with Bella in the middle of the night. I froze. It wasn't a dream. It was real. It had to make sense by the law of something right. I kept muttering as my roommate told me to forget it and everything would be all right. God, I wish he was right. The days after that I couldn't sleep. I lost my appetite and skipped all of my classes. All I could do was rationalize the situation. It stopped calling out my dog as it started to copy my muttering. I could tell it was my voice, but something was just off about it. Sometimes it was exactly the same, others it was in slow motion, and sometimes even in different octaves. But it always did do something. It always laughed after mimicking me. Its laugh sounded like a twisted version of me crying. Today the voice stopped and it told me something. It didn't taunt me or torture me. It just told me to come closer. It took my voice again and repeated, "Don't be afraid, champ. Come here." It kept saying it over and over again. But this time it sounded inviting. It made me calm, so I finally unlocked the door and climbed up. What I saw chilled me to my core. Standing before me was this creature that vaguely resembled a human. I could tell it wasn't only mimicking me but also trying to become me. It had my body size and skin color right to the bone, but its flesh did not shift yet. It had open flesh wounds all over its body. It looked very malnourished, but the most horrifying was its neck. The neck wasn't like any human or mammal neck. It had gills. As I stood there in shock, it opened its mouth and the gills flapped and moved as it said, "Come here." Good girl. I left running and didn't look back. I left all my stuff and dropped out of college. I've never heard it since and have had a pretty good life after that. Got married and had a beautiful baby girl. I had completely forgotten about that thing until today at breakfast my daughter asked me, "Daddy, why did you talk so funny at night?" I was confused at first until it hit me. That thing has found me and it has come to finish its job. It's now on the other side of this door. I'm writing this with tears in my eyes, alone locked in my bathroom. The knocking has turned to pounding. I'm scared and terrified. I beg you, if you ever hear your own voice, pray as it as sure as hell has heard you. My mother has always been my best friend. She didn't like it when I made a new one. My mother and I have always been close. Ever since I was a child, she was the person who cared for me the most. At least that's how I felt. Of course, I had my father as well, and grandparents, but nothing ever came close to the bond I shared with my mother. Granted, this was probably because my mother was the only person in my family who was willing to do stuff with me. We'd go out to the supermarket or play ball in the backyard, and on rainy evenings we'd cuddle up close and do crossword puzzles or watch TV. She'd always tell me I was her pride and joy, and I mean, what kid doesn't like hearing that? Things changed when I started attending first grade. I'd never set foot in kindergarten or any preparatory classes, so the concept of school was entirely alien to me. But my mother said I had to go. "That's the law," she scoffed, as if it had been some major inconvenience. "I'll pick you up right after." That's a promise she certainly kept. Every single day she'd drop me right in front of the school and would be waiting for me the second I set foot outside the gates. One time, after the last bell rang, I tagged behind some of my classmates to listen in on their discussion about a new movie that was coming out in theaters and didn't even notice my mother walking rapidly towards me. She grabbed my arm as soon as I exited the gates. "Who are those boys?" she demanded. I don't know, Mom. They're just my classmates." My words seemed to alleviate the crease in her forehead. "Well, don't waste your breath talking to them. You're much too clever for that." I nodded, watching as the boys in question gestured excitedly to their own parents. That's another thing about my childhood. I was never allowed to have any friends. Well, it wasn't like the other kids in my school were particularly interested in me either way. Certainly not enough to sit next to me at lunch or even lend me a pencil. My parents never really bothered with school supplies and thought that a pen and a block of A4 paper would suffice for whatever shenanigans we got up to. What do they really teach kids in first grade anyway? My mother shook her head, lighting up a cigarette. "If you need any other supplies, just ask your father. He'll be in his office." But I never went near the office. In fact, I didn't much like my father at all. He always sat in front of his computer and never took any notice of me, and he always smelled strongly of alcohol. I shuddered at the thought. It's okay, Mom, I'll manage," I said, praying she wouldn't send me there anyway. "I'm sure I can just borrow some colored pencils from the teacher." "That's my boy," she said, ruffling my hair. I never asked for anything after that. Not when we learned to fold origami, not when we made Christmas cards, and definitely not when we modeled animals out of clay. Could I borrow some glue? I asked a boy named Thomas, who sat nearest to me. That day, we were scrapbooking, and my shark cutout wouldn't stay glued down, despite being almost drenched in spit. But Thomas only wrinkled his nose and sniggered. Look guys, Stinky is drooling all over his page. The other children laughed, but I was mortified. That became my nickname from that point on. Stinky. I had no idea why they called me that. I bathed and showered regularly and my clothes were always clean and ironed. Oh, don't pay them any mind, my mother said. They're kids. You know what I was called at school? Fidgety Fran. That's right. See, it isn't so bad. If they call you names, just call them names back. There's a good boy. Now, go give Grandma a kiss and she'll read you a bedtime story. I hesitated. Mom, can you read the bedtime story, please? Why? Grandma's already waiting for you in your bedroom. I helped her all the way up the stairs. Please, Mom. Grandma reads so slowly. Oh, all right, kiddo. Go choose a book then, but only for tonight, eh? I nodded happily and ran up the stairs to give Grandma her goodnight kiss. To say I was lonely would have been an understatement. Of course, I loved and valued my family, but friendship with children my own age was a concept I had never experienced. I watched with envy as my classmates swapped the lunches their parents had packed for them, played tag during break times, and whispered to each other when the teacher wasn't looking. I knew I wasn't allowed to, but I longed to have a friend of my own. Little did I know, my wish was about to come true, and not at all in the way I expected. Mitch joined our class just after Easter. Apparently, his family had relocated and our school was one of the only ones to have an opening. I remember feeling quite sorry for him as our teacher propped him up on her desk in front of the entire class to make an introduction. It was obvious that Mitch was different from the other kids. He wore sandals instead of sneakers, tweed trousers instead of jeans, and carried a large warm briefcase in place of a backpack. It's my dad's, he whispered when he caught me looking at it during lunch. He said I could have it for school. I nodded, not wanting to risk hurting his feelings. The table next to mine had been empty, so our teacher had assigned the seat to Mitch. I wouldn't have minded if the arrangement hadn't made even more of a spectacle out of me. Look, the weird new kid is talking to Stinky, Thomas jeered, causing the class to erupt into a fit of giggles. But Mitch didn't even bat an eye. "Wanna be friends?" he asked, holding out his hand. On his palm was a bar of chocolate. I drooled at the sight. The most my mother ever packed for me was a piece of fruit or half a slice of toast. I knew Mitch's offering came with a price. We'd have to be friends. "Oh, okay," I whispered, gingerly taking the chocolate from him and clutching it in my palms. I couldn't believe it. I had a friend. Immediately, sirens blared in my brain as I thought of my mother's reaction. I couldn't tell her. She'd been so angry that time she thought she saw me talking to my classmates. She'd be livid if she knew I really was. So, I made sure to say goodbye to Mitch before I reached the school gates every afternoon and pretended I'd know him whenever my mother was nearby. One time, our parents dropped us off at the same time and I had to dash inside before my mother could get any ideas. "Why were you running?" he'd asked when he caught up with me in the school hallway. "Class doesn't start for another 20 minutes. "Oh, it's just," I mumbled under my breath, "I just like running." It was clear Mitch didn't believe a word I was saying. "Listen, my mom asked if you'd like to come over this afternoon for dinner. She's making lasagna. She said she could call your mom to tell her." No, the words came rushing out before I could stop them. I can't. It's my grandma's birthday and I can't miss it. "Okay," Mitch shrugged. "Another day then." I knew I wouldn't be able to keep this up for long. I'd have to come clean. But how do you tell the only friend you've ever had that even speaking to him is akin to treason? Plus, I never even understood why I wasn't allowed to have friends, let alone speak to kids my own age. I'd asked, but my mother was adamant that family was the only thing that really mattered. "But other kids have friends," I wailed. "Other kids also call you nasty names. Do you really want to be like them? You're so much better than that, Sam. We love you for you." I believed her. I wanted to believe her, until that fateful day when everything literally went to shit. "I'm not going to be able to pick you up today, sweetheart," my mother said as we pulled up to the school gates. "Can you walk home by yourself? It's only a few blocks but I barely heard the rest. Walk home, all by myself. My mother had never even been a second late before, and now she was trusting me to get home all on my own. "Now, don't forget, look both ways before you cross the road and heat up the grilled cheese in the microwave." I stared at her in stunned silence. When will you be back?" "Oh," she waved her hand dismissively. "I shouldn't be too long. Just some errands." "You'll be fine, honey. If you need anything, just ask your dad. He'll help. Grandma's coming with me, so she won't be around." I winced at the thought of asking Dad anything. but nodded. Okay, Mom, there's a good boy, she smiled, planting a kiss on my forehead. Off you go. So, off I went. By the time I sat down at my desk, I was almost giddy with excitement. I was being trusted to walk home all by myself. My mother had even given me the key to the house. Suddenly, I felt sophisticated and grown up. Not even Thomas and his buddies could bother me that day. I was out the door the moment lessons were over, Mitch tailing me. Hey, where are you running off to? He called. Wait up. I'm walking home on my own today, I announced proudly. My mom is running some errands and said she can't pick me up. Oh, he looked intrigued. Can I come over? I gawked at him, unsure of whether he was kidding or not. It's all right. I'll let my mom know at the gate. I'm sure she won't mind. It's not. I'm not sure if. What? His tone was piercing. I thought about it for a moment. This could be my chance to actually have a friend over for the first time in my life. My mother never had to know. She and Grandma would be out for the next couple of hours and Dad never came out of his study anyway. You know what? I said, taking a deep breath. You can come over. We'll hang out. Great. Mitch looked genuinely pleased. It's about time. Still, I felt wary as we exited the school gates, looking around for my mother's car or a familiar face. What's wrong? Mitch asked. Why are you so twitchy? It's nothing, really, I stammered. Can we walk faster? We sped down the sidewalk, Mitch's leather briefcase slapping against his shin with each step. How far is your house? He inquired, clearly out of breath. It's close, I replied, my heart hammering unevenly in my chest. What if Mother's car was in the driveway? What if she was waiting for me to get home to see if she could trust me? What would she say when she saw I wasn't alone? Is this it? Mitch asked as we turned into the cul-de-sac, the yellow one. Yeah, I nodded, fumbling in my pocket for the key. This way. I led him up the steps and stuck the key into the lock. My heart was practically leaping out of my throat and my skin was clammy with sweat as I opened. Mom, I called out instinctively, praying there'd be no response. Silence. I heaved a sigh of relief and ushered Mitch inside, slamming the door shut behind him. Wow, he said, his nose wrinkling. What is that smell? I stared at him. What smell? Can't you smell that? It's like pickles. Mitch half nodded, half shook his head, an expression of disgust on his face. Sorry, I said quickly, maybe someone's been cooking. I showed him into the kitchen, but there didn't seem to be any mysterious new dish in sight. We have some leftover grilled cheese, I said sheepishly, not daring to meet his eye. Cool. Mitch seemed unfazed. Shouldn't we say hello to your dad? You said he'd be in, right? Yeah, but I tried to think of the proper thing to say. We don't have to, really. He's probably busy in his study. Well, it won't take a minute. We'll just say hello. My heart skipped a beat. No, really, I don't talk to my dad much. Oh, Mitch looked slightly taken aback. All right, then. We ate yesterday's grilled cheese in silence. I saw Mitch looking around the room curiously, his gaze fixating on a stack of cleaning supplies sitting by the sink. I waited for him to ask questions, but he didn't say anything. So, what do you want to do now? He asked, wiping his greasy lips with the back of his sleeve. Should we go up to your room? I glanced at the clock. Half an hour had passed since we'd gotten home. Mom and Grandma weren't due for another hour and a half. Still, I figured it'd be better to see Mitch off 30 minutes early just in case. Sure, but only for an hour. Okay, then you'll have to go. Mitch studied me, a puzzled look on his face, but nodded all the same. We trudged up the stairs, our school bags in tow. Actually, could I use your bathroom real quick? Mitch said, dropping his belongings onto my bed. Yeah, it's down the hall, first door on the left. Nonchalantly, I waved towards the room in question. I felt really grown up. We never had guests at my house, aside from the occasional postman or drunk partygoer, so having a friend over felt new and alien to me. But I loved it all the same. I was just pulling out my selection of board games from the cupboard when a high-pitched shriek pierced the air. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My skin prickling, I dashed into the corridor. Mitch was standing hunched over and retching last night's grilled cheese onto the carpet. Oh, Mitch, I cried, staring at the mess he'd made. I'll never get this out in time. But Mitch wasn't listening. He stood there, sobbing and clutching his feverish face. I noticed he was shaking. What's wrong? I asked, alarmed by his sudden change in demeanor. Is it the food? He looked up at me, his eyes brimming with tears, his face contorted into an expression of disgust. What is wrong with you? I gawked at him, taken aback. Well, what do you mean? And then I saw it. The door to my grandfather's room was ajar. Mitch must have mixed up his right and left. Stay away from me. Mitch raised his hands. I'm going home. A strong smell of pickle juice and alcohol wafted from my grandfather's room and I rushed over to shut the door, my eyes burning. Don't go, Mitch, please. I struggled to find the right words. It's only Grandpa. You're crazy, Mitch cried. Only Grandpa, or what's left of him. How long has he been sitting there? Tears rolled down my cheeks as I pictured Mitch finding my grandfather, his skin covered in pupae, his mouth crawling with maggots. It's only natural, my mother would tell me whenever I'd feel hesitant to help her. That's why we have to bathe him frequently. Mitch, I whispered, you're my best friend. Please, don't leave. His eyes suddenly widened. Is that why we can't see your dad? He muttered, slowly backing away from me down the corridor. Is that it? I didn't know what to tell him. My family was all I'd ever known. For the longest time I thought this was the way things were meant to be. Suddenly, the door slammed downstairs. Mother was home. Sam, she called, we're back. We froze. My heart was galloping in my chest and making me feel lightheaded. What on earth was I going to do? How would I explain this? Hello, Mother called again. Anyone home? I cleared my throat. Yes, Mom. My voice wasn't much more than a squeak. I felt so frightened. I wanted to fall to my knees and weep, but I couldn't let Mitch down. There you are, Mother said, coming up the stairs. Did you get home from school, Oka? Her gaze swept over the vomit on the carpet, and then to me and Mitch. I could see the panic in her eyes before she even said anything. Who's this? She whispered, staring at my friend. I stood still, my head hung low, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Sam, who is this? I heard Mitch draw a deep breath. I'm Mitch. From school. It's nice to meet you, Sam's mom. The silence was almost deafening. It was a while before I dared look up. My mother was still standing on the stairs, a distant look in her eyes. I'm sorry, Mom, I managed. It was an accident. I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. I didn't know why my mother was so upset. Was it the vomit on the carpet? Was it my new friend? Was it something about Grandma? You have no idea what you've done, my mother whispered, shaking her head slowly. You've ruined us. You've destroyed this family. I stared at her, my eyes welling up with tears again. I am sorry, Mom. I didn't. But she wasn't listening. Get downstairs and bring the formaldehyde, the one in the brown bottle, and some rags. I'll take care of this. But I stood there, unmoving. Now, Sam, she snapped, climbing up the rest of the stairs and facing us, quickly, before someone comes looking. I knew perfectly well what was about to happen. This wasn't the first time my mother had asked me to bring her the brown bottle. In fact, she used it religiously every week. Mom, no, I tried. Mitch is innocent. It was me who brought him home. Please. But she only shook her head. It has to be done, Sam. You don't want Mommy to go away, do you? Suddenly, she didn't look anything like my mother. Her face was creased with deep lines and her scalp was slick with perspiration. Please, Mom, I begged. Mitch is my friend. But she wasn't having it. I am your friend. You have your family. Isn't that enough for you? I won't let this destroy what we have. If you won't help me, she swallowed. I'll just have to do it myself. With that, she charged towards us like an enraged bull. We screamed, turning to run, but there was nowhere to go. Mother grabbed Mitch by his arm and dug her nails in until he screamed. Please, he cried, thrashing about. Please help me, Sam. But there was nothing I could do. I screamed and cried as Mother dragged Mitch into the bathroom and the lock clicked. After a few minutes, the screams ceased and the house went quiet. All I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat in my ears and my own muffled sobs. Of course, the police found out anyway. Mitch had told his parents he was going to my house at the school gates, and as the evening drew to a close, they'd started to worry. The phone rang several times that night, but Mother didn't want to pick it up. She said she was too tired and just wanted to take a nap. Eventually, a police car pulled up to our house and she was left with no choice. They took her away and that's how I ended up in foster care. I got to visit my mother once a year, but as time went on and as I got older, I stopped going. She was different, somehow, more and more unhinged each time I went to see her. I did eventually make friends, lots of them. After being deprived of contact for so long, I made friends left and right to make up for lost time. But I never forgot about my family, not even when I was old enough to move out and get a place of my own. I'm in my late 30s now, but I still often think about them. I think about the day the prison called to tell me my mother had died. They'd asked me to arrange a burial, and I promised I would. It's been 2 years since then and I'm still getting around to it. But it's just so comforting having my mother in my living room. If you get a late night Amber Alert, it's probably best to ignore it. Beep, beep, beep. Dreary eyes creaked open halfway and almost lifeless, gazing at the television screen that faced the rest of the living room. White and bold text against a black background as dark as night, subtle shadows formed around the coffee table and the edges of the couch from the screen's illumination. The piercing alarm echoed and blared through, that oh-so-familiar shriek of an emergency alert broadcast that shattered the night's blanket of tranquil silence. Each loud beep had its timely equal interval of a second before a long monotone alarm of a low, and static frequency ring through. "This shit again," I mumbled, realizing I had fallen asleep at the couch. "The following message is being transmitted at the public request of the Washington State Department of Safety. This is an Amber Alert." Momentarily half asleep, a frown formed on my face as a wave of perplexed confusion rushed over that followed a sinking sense of dread. It was enough to send a jolt to my senses that erased the last of somnolence, and to think I heard the voice wrong. But there he was in plain, white, and foreboding text. "Child abduction emergency. At 11:53 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time, a young girl was taken from near her home in Colville. The girl is believed to be 7-year-old Anna Carter. She is 4 feet and 1 inch tall, white complexion, weighs 51 pounds, has black hair, and brown eyes. She was last seen wearing a blue and pink floral dress with a red headband and white sneakers. Her abductor is believed to." The gruff and piercing voice of the announcer faded off into the background as my murky brain attempted to process the stream of information. An abduction, this late at night. A warm summer night would tempt the town's kids to spend the evening hours at the playground. But this late, I couldn't imagine what the parents were going through, and for the unfortunate set of circumstances to occur was horrifying enough. If the abduction was a few hours ago, then the girl was long gone from the town by then, as pessimistic it was to think that. Probably across the state by now. The broadcast ended as soon as it began, though the alarm remained to echo in my rattled mind even after I turned the television off. And heading up the stairs, I performed my usual nightly routine of washing my face as I readied for bed, letting the cool waters tame my swirling mind for once. I turned off my bedroom light and took one last gaze out the window. The neighborhood stood in deathly silence, an ordinary and lifeless scene in the darkest hours of the night. Faint outlines of evergreen trees towered in the far distance, barely illuminated by the stars shining like beacons. Much closer, street lamps casted their pools of light onto barren, gray roads. I almost glanced away from the bed, but I noticed subtle movement out the corner of my peripheral window. There were 2 individuals walking together on the sidewalk, revealed in yellow hue by the streetlights. An adult man and a young girl. Because of how a part of my roof jets out into a triangular prism, I had not noticed them until I adjusted my posture. The girl merrily skipped along with the man walking a few paces behind, and it would have been an overall a sweet and charming scene if it wasn't almost 3 in the morning. And upon focusing on the blue flowery patterns on her pink floral dress, my heart slowly sank into the pit of my stomach. Her dark velvet headband reflected ominously under the dim lighting, revealing the child's darkened long hair that swayed as she skipped playfully. That had to be her, the girl from the Amber Alert, prancing innocently as if that man, the abductor, was her father. I'm not the one to make assumptions, but a scene like that in the dead darkness of the night raised all forms of suspicious alarms. I should have minded my own business. I turned away and grabbed myself from the nightstand, promptly dialing 911 on the home screen to report a possible sighting of the girl. Only 5 seconds passed since I took my eyes off the 2. Only 5 fucking seconds, and upon returning my gaze to the girl, I let out an audible gasp and I nearly dropped the phone. She was staring at me, along with the man now beside her, frozen where they stood beneath the lamp, the eerie lighting casting upon dead, wide eyes, fixated directly into my own pupils, up into my second-story window, massively wide eyes that seemed too disproportionate in comparison to their nose and mouth. My room was in complete darkness. How could they have noticed I was looking? I was so in shock and out of breath that I failed to hear the barely audible voice of a female dispatcher from my phone trying to get my attention. I took my eyes off the pair just briefly, stating my full name and home address before proceeding to answer the dispatcher about my concerns. As calmly as I could, I explained my sighting of the missing girl, describing her clothing that would match with the broadcast from earlier. When I took a glance back at the 2 to have a better look at the abductor, a massive wave of dread and disgust flooded past me. At the torso, the girl was now bent at a grotesque, sharp angle to the side while her arms were twisted past the capability of a normal elbow, as if she was a puppet loosely held by invisible strings from the heavens. Her head, however, was snapped upright and maintained the same fierce and wide stare into my eyes with those sunken, large, jet black irises. Fucking both of them were in this inhuman, convoluted stance, gleaming their eyes into my fucking soul. Just a longing fixed gaze with eyes as black as the sky above. "Hello, sir," the dispatcher questioned through the phone. But I wasn't paying attention. I caught the sight of crimson blood leaking from their nose and ears in the faint light, before completely shutting the window with heavy drapes and resuming my frantic tone with the dispatcher. "Yeah, I still see them." I gulped with a subtle lie, my curiosity getting the best of me and trying to take the tiniest peek past the window. In a split-second glimpse, the pair had vanished, vanished as quickly as they had spotted me. The police took notes on my descriptions of the girl and the unknown adult man. Soon enough, the pair long gone upon the cops' arrival. I explained the basis of what I saw, the descriptions and actions of the girl, the man sporting dark jeans and a white t-shirt alongside her, yet I refrained from mentioning the full details. The following days, there were sporadic alerts on the two's whereabouts, a few witness accounts that spotted them here and there. Any news of it dissipated, and the missing posters were scrapped. But that night I know I saw something that was absolutely inhuman, something not from this world, for after I had closed off the window and awaited the authorities, the image was forever burned in my mind, that along with her lifeless stare and vacant eyes, she was smiling, not a smile of malicious intent, but almost a sincere smile to tell me she was somehow at peace. No trace of them was ever found, and anything I tried to follow up online yielded nothing. No talk of an Amber Alert the next morning in the local news, nor did anyone new was added to a missing persons directory. I don't know what I saw that night, and I don't know what they were, how they picked up on me looking at them but seemingly refraining from harming me. My next approach would be to talk to some of my neighbors who may have been awake last night and seen the commotion. But all I know is that if they ever return, they know where the fuck I live. The Swan. I remember the day we met, seeing her sitting in the front yard alone, eyeing the moving truck curiously as she fidgeted with a dirty stuffed animal, a little head of long blonde hair blowing in the wind. In a strange way, I think of it as a destined friendship. Despite the two of us being doomed children in the middle of nowhere, it was the day I moved in with my grandmother, an unfortunate fresh start on the outskirts of town, far away from a normal life and even further from the empty house left behind after the death of my parents. My grandmother, long widowed by the loss of my grandfather, took me in with what I assumed as a child was welcomed and loving, but perhaps reluctantly unprepared arms. I would later learn that my grandmother was simultaneously serving as next and last of kin. After getting the bleak tour of my grandmother's cluttered house, she showed me to where I would start staying, a small room that laid bare save for a single bed and antique dresser. I only had a few boxes of things left to my name, ones the movers had stacked in the middle of the room to already clutter the only neat room in the house. I remember my grandmother telling me two things before leaving me to unpack alone. You're very handsome. You look just like your grandfather. Drunk driving is a sin, and whoever robbed you of your parents is rotting in hell. And with that, she left me in the incredibly dim room to make me something to eat. I remember just sitting on my bed and looking at the boxes, unsure if it mattered to actually open them. Losing your parents at 7 years old has a habit of making you painfully aware and dull. In the days of hushed adult whispers leading up to moving out of town, I contemplated the purpose of my continued existence in the absence of my parent. With everything feeling so dark, I didn't see the point in opening the boxes or doing anything at all. It was until I heard something hit my window. For a while, I just stared at the window dumbfounded. There was nothing to do in her house, which seemed packed wall to wall with collectibles and a cabinet full of bottles that my grandfather had collected. No video games, no toys. From my sunken perch on the bed, I watched the window, wondering if I had actually heard the noise or just imagined it. Soon the sound happened again, in the form of a rock hitting the window. When I gathered the courage to saunter over and look, I could see the girl from next door. She froze when I saw her, one hand poised to throw another pebble, the other holding the stuffed animal in the crook of her arm. When I opened it, she dropped the pebble and came over, standing on her tippy toes to introduce herself. My name's Penny. Why are you here? She asked shyly, bouncing on her toes. I just moved in. My parents died, I said, mostly mumbling. I'm sorry. My mommy ran away when I was a baby. You want to be friends? I didn't understand the bruises on her arms and why she had them. I didn't understand how dark and empty the world suddenly became and why I still had to be a part of it. I didn't understand a lot when I was younger, but there was one thing I clearly understood. Penny and I would in fact be friends. It took me a while to come out of my shell, but I never fully made it back out. I didn't talk very much, something Penny accepted quickly. Neither of us spoke much, really. I remember we would play in her yard most of the time with whatever toys we had, with the understanding that I would never mistreat her stuffed animal. Despite it being dirty and ripped in places, Penny held it close at all times, no matter what we were doing. It's a swan, Penny would say. My mommy gave it to me before she ran away. It didn't look much like a swan, years of wear making it look more like a tired seagull. But Penny swore it was a swan, so I took her word for it. I remember asking why her mother left. One of the first sentences spoken to her. She just shrugged and looked at the ground for a while, chewing her lip and holding the little swan close. Minutes would go by with her lost in thought, and I would just sit there and wait for her. Then she would perk up all of a sudden and ask to play tag or hide and seek. We would play day in and day out, usually until my grandmother called me for dinner. Penny would frown and watch me go, and I always felt bad for leaving. I would check on her during dinner, and she would just be sitting on her porch with her swan, or sometimes tossing rocks into the creek that made up half our backyards. I didn't know why she never liked being inside her house, and every time I mentioned her daddy, she didn't want to talk about it. Penny's daddy didn't come out of the house much. Whenever he did, it was usually to yell at Penny for being outside, although he always talked slowly and didn't make sense most of the time. He would always be tired, and he would always be angry. It would be years before I understood that her daddy was a drunk, and that he liked to beat on her. Things like that have a habit of sitting on the back burner when you are little. I mentioned the bruises to my grandmother, and she said we shouldn't talk about it, that it was their business. Penny didn't want to talk about it either, so I pretended not to see them. In retrospect, I think my grandmother knew and wanted to help. She just didn't know how. She would do things to try and make it better every once in a while, like invite her over for dinner when her father was asleep, or bring her sweets discreetly when she had been baking. I remember on an especially bad day, Penny had a busted lip, and my grandmother said something like, "He's all she's got. Sometimes you just have to hang in until things get better." There was something so sad about how she said it, and I could tell she was trying not to cry. I remember it feeling sad and gray for a long time, but the sadness wouldn't be so bad if I could see my grandmother and Penny smile. In my bleak home in the middle of nowhere, I decided if they were happy with how things were, maybe I could learn to be happy too. As the years passed, things started to get better, a little. When I opened up a bit more, I started calling my grandmother Gran, which seemed to make her happy. Gran didn't speak of my grandfather much, other than the fact he enjoyed collecting rare bottles of whiskey. He never drank them, which didn't make much sense to me. Gran said some people collected strange things, and she was just thankful he didn't collect guns instead. Even though he had passed years ago, she still kept the cabinet clean and dusted. I would spend nights looking at the old bottles, trying to imagine my grandfather holding them when I read the label. Penny and I became great friends, a friendship that lasted even after we started going to school. We would ride the bus together, an old rickety shuttle that would take us to a school I didn't much care for. It's not because I didn't have my old friends there anymore, but because the other kids weren't interested in being our friends. Penny and I were the same age as all the other kids, but they just treated us differently. I would often hear them whisper nasty things to each other, sometimes about Penny, sometimes about me. They would often whisper of the marks and bruises Penny seemed to have, the ones I had gotten used to not acknowledging. They would talk about how she wore the same clothes a lot, and how often they were dirty. They would talk about how I didn't have a mom and dad, and sometimes speculate over what happened to them. Sometimes they would say I killed them. Other times they would say they didn't love me anymore because I was bad. The teachers would hush and scold them, but they would always say something again. They would always leave us out of activities and pretend they didn't see us. In time I found I hated school, but as long as the two of us could play together once we got home, everything would be all right. At the end of every gloomy day we had each other. The older I got, the more I came to terms with the loss of my parents. The void they left behind never truly filled, but Gran did her best to raise me and be there for me. Some days were worse than others, and Penny had a habit of picking up on it and finding ways to cheer me up. In return, I was always there for her when she needed me, although I wasn't as good at noticing. Penny would always let me know, however, in the form of a pebble hitting my window. We would sneak out some nights, something that proved easy with how early Gran always went to bed and how drunk Penny's father always was. We would tiptoe through the shallow creek and duck under the trees that grew along it, keeping quiet until we reached the cornfield that started at the end of our property. The corn would stretch for miles over the hills, but before that was a tiny patch that never sprouted like it should. It was our little secret spot, a nice place where we could lay down and look at the stars and hear the cicadas chirp. Our own little paradise, away from the things that reminded us of how bad it was, me, her, and her stuffed swan. Laying down in the squashed and malformed cornstalks, we would talk about our dreams. I would tell her about my dreams where there was no car accident and everything was full of color again. Penny would listen, propped up on her elbow with a little smile, holding her sad seagull-looking stuffed animal close, and smiling as I talked. In that moment, I could lift the weight on my shoulders and let some semblance of light in. I could talk to her in a way I couldn't with Gran, with her mutual understanding of a parent blinking out of sight. I would speak of my dreams, and when I was finished, she would touch my arm and say that was lovely. In her adolescent country accent, I would roll over and wait as she looked to the stars, snuggling her stuffed animal that looked sadder and sadder as time moved on. She would close her eyes and think for a moment, putting together the full memory she always managed to recollect. When she opened them, I remembered seeing the reflection of the moon in her eyes, her little globes wide and marveling at the shining sky above. Penny would tell me how she dreamt of being a swan, It was a dream she had often, one I would get to know and love more every time she told it. She would tell me she dreamt of dancing among the stars as a swan, spreading her wings and flying across the sky. Up above would be a world free of pain and suffering, a world full of light that would shine so bright it would erase the pain of everything you'd been through. In her dream, she could stretch her legs and run as far away as she wanted, feeling the wind on her feathers as she soared across the sky. She said that in her dream, if she flew far enough, she would find her mother. I watch her tell her story, the reflection of the stars glinting in her eyes. She would look happy, and the smile she wore while telling her story would put me at ease and momentarily dull the feeling of loss and longing for days to come. It didn't matter how rough things were at school or how empty it felt at home. I would think of Penny the swan, and I would feel better. Just as sleep would try and take me, Penny would help me up and tell me it was time to go home. Together we would duck back under the trees and mind our footing through the creek, hoping we could creep back home just as soundlessly as we had left. Things continued as normal into middle school. I wasn't interested in having other friends. Whenever I had finished my schoolwork, I took to books rather than socializing. Talking to others wasn't something I was particularly good at, and even if I was good at conversation, we didn't have anything in common. Grant didn't have a lot of money, so I was out of touch from whatever video game or movie craze everyone seemed to chat about. As Penny grew older, she learned to embrace her independence at home and spent a lot of time taking better care of herself and her home. Her clothes were much cleaner and she spent a lot of time keeping her long hair straight and untangled. Gran did whatever she could to make sure she had essentials like toothbrushes and decent conditioner, and whenever she bought clothes for me, she always tried to sneak in something for her as well. The school counselors knew what was happening at home and sometimes reached out and made some attempt to address the issue. Penny's father would get better for a time. The bruises would stop and things would feel better, but it never lasted long, and after a while, I suppose they stopped seeing the bruises like I once did. Maybe it was easier for them. When things were especially bad, I would hear the pebble hit my window. We would go to our secret spot and talk of our dreams, the one thing that would always reset things for a time. But as I got older, I dreamed of my parents less and thought more of Penny finding another home, one where things weren't so bad all the time. Penny still talked of the same dream, her dream of being a swan. It still held the same radiance as it always did, but it made me feel differently when I heard it. Now when she told it, I wished somehow it could come true. The summer after I turned 13, things started to change. It was a hot day in July, and I had just finished mowing the yard for Gran. It was the first nice day after a long string of rain, and the creek had gone up above knee level for the first time in years. Penny was hanging out in the grass, drawing a picture of the sad-looking swan stuffed animal. She still carried it around from time to time, but it was hardly recognizable and falling apart. The eyes were barely holding on, and the fur had shed so much in spots it was bald. It was sweltering out, and Gran suggested we swim in the creek since we didn't have a sprinkler or anything. It was something we hadn't done since we were little. Last one there is a rotten egg, Penny yelled, leaving her swan and drawings in the yard. Penny didn't have a swimsuit, so we both went in with our clothes on. The water was freezing, so we took turns splashing each other and running away. Gran watched from the top of the hill, laughing as we trounced through the creek. Penny was wearing shorts and one of her father's old t-shirts, one so long her knees would catch on it in the water. It would slow her down when she fought with it, so I would always be able to get away. We went back and forth for a while, splashing and jumping until Gran called from atop the hill and said she was going to go back inside to make us some lemonade. When Gran was gone, Penny told me to turn around and cover my eyes. I teased her about it, thinking she would use the opportunity to try and get the jump on me. She swore she wouldn't cheat, and after going back and forth I sighed and did as she asked. Behind me I heard her messing with something, giggling in between the sounds of her straining with something. After a wet plap on the water, she told me to turn around and open them. I lowered my hands and turned around to see she had taken off her shirt. I had never really looked at a girl before, let alone see or even know what a bra was, and Penny used my awkward double take to her advantage. "See if you can outrun me now," she said, before bolting through the water. Penny tackled me before I could get away, sending us both into the chilly water. We rolled and flailed, splashing each other through bouts of laughter. Penny tried to hold me under the water and I tried to escape, taking turns as the water murked beneath us. We went back and forth, wrestling and laughing until we collapsed from exhaustion, both of us gasping and giggling on our butts in the water. I don't know if it was the special glint in her eyes or the curve of her smile, but it felt different, like a jar of fireflies had been released in my stomach. Penny scrunched her face and pulled her knees to her chest, suddenly looking embarrassed. "What?" she said, blushing as she looked away, and wiped the long matted strands from her face. She looked at the hill and froze, the color draining just as quickly as it arrived. I could then hear the footsteps. On the hill was her father, his glazed eyes holding a dead stare. "It's not, we were just," Penny stammered, scrambling for her discarded shirt. Penny's father yanked her out of the creek by her hair, dragging her up the hill as she screamed and kicked. I wanted to stop him, but I was scared, and he was much bigger than me. "You're a whore, just like your mother. You want to run away, just like she did," he shouted in her ear, holding her up with a fistful of hair. When Penny didn't answer, he only got angrier. He tried instigating more, but Penny stayed quiet, sobbing softly as she reached for her yanked hair. He looked around angrily, eyes wild as he sought someone else to inflict his rage upon. At first he looked at me, but was distracted when he saw the stack of papers. With a scowl, he let her go and shambled over to the drawings, grabbing all of them in crinkled handfuls. He stared at the pictures of swans, looking over each one with his puffy eyes. Without a word, he ripped them to pieces, scattering them to the wind as Penny cried on the ground. Just when I thought his tantrum was finished, he saw the stuffed animal and snatched it up with a grunt. Penny begged him to stop, but it only seemed to fuel his rage. He twisted the stuffed swan's head until it tore and pulled it apart until the stuffing scattered across the yard. When she tried to stop him, he slapped her, a vicious echo that seemed to carry for miles. I remember Gran coming out of the house and dropping the lemonade, pleading with Penny's father that we were just kids. Him and Gran shouted at each other, and in the end Gran sat and started crying. I remember looking at Penny for a moment and feeling guilty that I had looked at her like I did. I didn't understand what her father meant when he said those things to her, but I felt like it was my fault. Like maybe if I didn't look at her like I did, maybe she wouldn't have gotten in trouble. After he dragged Penny into the house and slammed the door shut, he yelled at her for a while. I wish there was something I could do. I remember getting out of the creek and Gran just sitting there saying, I'm sorry, over and over, rocking back and forth. I didn't understand why she was sorry. I didn't understand any of it. I spent the rest of the afternoon staring out my window, looking at Penny's house. In my hands was the torn-up stuffed animal, mangled and deflated beyond recognition. The pictures had all blown away before I could grab them, the wind growing fierce as the sunshine turned to an ugly, overcast gray. By the time the yelling had subsided, it started to rain, and I found myself looking through the downpour at Penny's window, hoping she was all right. Looking at her house gave me a terrible feeling, a dread that I couldn't describe. I was used to the way things were for Penny, but for some reason, this time felt worse. When my eyes grew too heavy, I curled up on my bed. I looked at the stuffed swan as I drifted off to sleep, praying that somewhere in the noise of the storm, I would hear the sound of a pebble hitting the glass. Hours later, I found my prayer had been answered. I opened my eyes to the soft tink of the pebble, the familiar chime that found me even through the barrage of rain and wind. I sat up immediately, throwing off the covers and grabbing the stuffed swan to meet Penny at the window. I could see her through the glass, a pale silhouette through the film of spattering rain. I opened the window and was hit by a chilly gust that sucked the warmth from my room. I motioned for Penny quietly, and she hurried over, holding a hand up against the pelting mist. Her nightgown was soaked and her hair was matted and tangled. She leaned against the window shivering. Her hands trembled on the windowsill. "Penny, are you all right?" I was so worried. I started to whisper, but stopped. Something was wrong. The way she was looking down, the way her bottom lip trembled. Her cheery perseverance was gone, and in its place, a cold and broken shell. I reached for her and she flinched away, shuddering against the storm as she hugged herself. I waited for her to say something, but I got my answer when she looked up. The left side of her face had been horribly beaten. Her left eye was swollen shut, accompanied by a dark purple bruising that went from the top of her cheek to the corner of her mouth. I felt the tears immediately, along with the sudden sickening pull in my stomach. "Penny, no." My whisper was hushed by a clammy finger and a faint smile. "It's okay. It doesn't hurt much." "Not anymore," she said, but her eyes told a different story. I looked past her to the storm outside, unable to see the creek through the stormy night. "Are you sure you want to go to our spot? I don't think we'll be able to see the stars. You want to just come inside?" I asked, but she shook her head. "No, there's something I want to show you. We'll be able to see, I'm sure, but I need you to do me a favor first. I don't have much time. It'll be worth it, I promise," she said, and I nodded. Penny told me she needed a bottle of whiskey from my grandfather's cabinet. She told me she felt bad for asking, but it was the only way to buy enough time for us to get away. She said it was important, and she would only have one chance to do it. I agreed, wanting to do whatever I could to help her. Penny hid at the window as I crept away, glancing back to her house nervously as I disappeared down the hall. I didn't know what time it was, but I knew it was late. I tiptoed down the hall, the sounds of a late-night game show coming in clearer as I drew near. Gran had a habit of falling asleep while watching television, and I hoped the storm hadn't woken her. I peeked into the living room to see her asleep, the television's glow flickering as she snored softly in her recliner. As quietly as I could, I walked in front of the screen towards my grandfather's collectible cabinet. I opened it slowly, keeping an eye on Gran as its squeaking blended with the applause of someone winning a grand prize. I grabbed the highest one I could reach, the weight of the bottle feeling dirty in my hands. I closed the cabinet, and Gran mumbled as the program went to commercial. After stirring under her blanket, the dry rasp of snoring continued. She was sound asleep. I tucked it under my shirt, feeling guilt. I snuck back to my room and anxiously closed the door behind me. I was sick with worry and scared to find Penny's father looking in when I went back to the window. Instead, I saw nothing, only the occasional flash of lightning illuminating the black outside. An empty yard, glistening in the rain. "Penny," I whispered, creeping up to the window. I poked my head outside, holding both the whiskey and the torn stuffed animal. Droplets pelted my face as I looked around, my stomach twisting as I saw nothing but wet grass. "I'm here." I jumped as Penny came up beside me, still shivering in her soaked nightgown. I asked her if she wanted a blanket or something, but she shook her head. I handed the bottle to her and she took it, cradling it like a glass baby. She looked down at the bottle in sadness, her untouched eye lingering on the bottle before she turned back to me. I held the stuffed animal out next. Penny looked at the broken swan, her lip trembling into a frown as the rain hit it. "I don't need it anymore," she said, and managed a faint smile. "Thank you for helping me. I shouldn't be long. You should bundle up. It's cold out here," she said and kissed me on the cheek. I stood there dumbfounded. "You're the best friend I've ever had," she said, and scurried back to her house. After she slinked through the back door, I still felt the cross-press of the kiss on my cheek. I looked at the little swan in my hand, feeling a whirlwind of emotions within me. I didn't know what was happening or how I was supposed to feel about it. I shut the window, set the swan on my dresser, and started putting on warmer clothes. Outside, the storm pressed on. I pulled on jeans and a sweatshirt, occasionally looking out my window to Penny's house. Her house stood eerily silent in the storm, and with no light inside it was impossible to know what was going on. I got some boots from the closet, thinking they would be better walking through the rain. After I put them on, I got in bed and covered myself in a blanket while I waited for Penny to return. I laid in the dark for a while, listening to the patter of rain. I thought of Penny and the kiss she gave me. I thought of her father and the wild look in his eyes. I thought of Gran and how she took me in. After a while, I thought of my parents and how it was harder to see their faces as time went on. As I busied myself with thoughts, the rain settled down to a drizzle, and the thunder was getting farther and farther apart. The wind no longer rattled the siding, and soon an agitated peace settled in. And with that, a pebble. Penny was waiting by the window when I got there, still in the same damp nightgown. She looked tired and cold, but determined. She held a finger to her lips before I could say anything, and nodded and climbed out the window. She took my hand and led me to the backyard, her bare feet in my boots squishing in the wet grass. Her grip was cold but fierce, but she looked back with a smile that assured me everything would be okay. The storm was fading, and on the horizon the dawn fought to poke through the gloom. Together we went down the hill leading to the creek, holding each other up each time the earth slid beneath us. The creek was rushing from the rain, but Penny didn't let it slow her down. She was focused, pushing through steadily as I held on tight. My boots sucked at the mud, but I kept up, sucking in breath as the cold water passed by my legs like ice. We made it through, both of us huffing with excited exhaustion. As I caught my breath, she let go of my hand and ducked into the trees that led to our secret spot. I looked back at our houses, the mental noise of the pain they brought fading the further we got away. When I ducked in, Penny had already reached the edge of the woods. She motioned for me to follow and disappeared into the corn. I followed quickly, clumsy soaked boots trudging through with every step. I tried to keep my focus ahead, watching the corn get closer and closer, and I tried to keep up. With the faint light of dawn, I noticed something in the mud beneath me. It didn't make sense at first, but the longer I looked, I started to notice a pattern. 2 sets of bare feet were imprinted in the mud, 2 facing in the direction of our houses, 2 facing the cornfield. A single smear dragged between them. The path led all the way to our secret spot. Once I reached the corn, I saw a single patch of disturbed stalks. Some of them had been flattened or broken, a path the smear ran directly through. On the other side of the corn, I could see the outline of Penny waiting patiently. As I waved my way through the stalks, I started to hear something, like an incoherent mumbling. It got louder the closer I got, the mumbling turning into the groaning, then mumbling again. When I made it to the secret spot, Penny was there. She walked over silently and took my hand and smiled. pulling me into a hug with both arms. She was still cold, but she wasn't shivering anymore. I had never hugged her before, and it was then I realized how thin she actually was, like she was sick. She rested her head on my shoulder for a while, and for a moment we just held each other in the peaceful dawn. She looked up at me and smiled, half of her face beaming, the other unable to. She touched my face, running her thumb over my cheek softly before looking to the sky. Above, the stars were shining, brighter than ever before. "Thank you for coming with me. Thank you for letting me show you," she said, and it was then I saw the wriggling shape behind her. On the ground was Penny's father, writhing on the ground. Lodged in his mouth was the bottle of whiskey, a heavy wrap of duct tape keeping it in place. The bottle was empty. She stepped out of the way so I could see, her smile fading to a blank slate of indifference. I looked at her father in surprise, instinctively stepping away from him. Penny held my hand tight and kept me by her side. Her father tried to struggle but couldn't, his unfocused eyes lolling at the sky as he fought against makeshift restraints of clothing and belts. Dribbles of vomit caked his face, and he seemed caught in a constant state of heavy gasping. Through the gasps were attempts at words, each of them heavily slurred and muffled by the lodged bottle. Before long, my gaze was pulled away from him. Behind him, the wide mass stirred in front of the corn, a shape almost concealed by the haze of the leaving nightfall. It moved with the sound of an ocean wave, its size expanding on each side, until I could see long, elegant feathers fan out like daggers. A long neck rose from its body, curving and extending until it was towered above. A head the size of my body looked directly at me, then started leaning toward me. A neon glow burst from the horizon, painting the shape as it encroached toward me. The giant swan stood with stark brilliance, its ballerina shape menacing and pure. Pitch black eyes narrowed on me, its massive and elegant beak poised and ready to stab me through the chest. I looked up at it helplessly, squeezing Penny's hand as I resisted the urge to let my bladder go. The beak kept reaching toward me, and when it was almost close enough to touch, it stopped. Penny reached out and placed her hand on the beak, and the colossal bird froze. It turned to her slowly, and she stepped forward to rest her head against the feathers on its neck. The animosity faded away, and the swan relaxed. It leaned into Penny's embrace, and above the stars glimmered in the static above. There was a deep humming in the swan's breast, and Penny smiled. Before I could relax, the swan looked back at me and softly prodded me in the chest with its beak. I looked at Penny and she nodded, and with a trembling hand I reached to pet its neck. Each feather is soft as the finest silk, but brimming with electrical energy, like I was touching a battery. When I looked into its eyes, I felt like it was looking into my soul. When the swan was done with me, there was a deep hum. Then it craned its head to look at Penny's father. The man lay miserably on the ground, still mumbling through his vomit. He tried to look around, but there was an absence in his eyes. Each thrash was confused and belligerent, resisting without knowing why. He didn't see the swan, even when it came for him. The beak parted as it reached his torso and clamped down slowly like a vice. The father screamed as it pinched together, breaking the restraints and peeling his flesh effortlessly. The swan's bite took everything with it, ripping layers of skin and muscle and leaving an exposed chest cavity in its wake. It reared back and swallowed the viscera, the mass sliding down its tube of a neck. I wanted to run. I looked at Penny and gasped. Penny's mouth was open wide, her jaws struggling as she bared her teeth. It kept opening until her jaw broke, a terrible wet crunch that brought tears to my eyes. She was looking at me, a single tear falling before her eye disappeared, buried under folds as her face scrunched and folded together, making way for what was forcing itself out of her throat. A long bill, blood-stained and burnt orange, kept protruding until it crowned a head. Penny's head separated to accommodate the expunging mass, and I watched in horror as her body tore vertically, and a pair of stained wings stretched from the remnants of her shoulders. The strings of the nightgown snapped, revealing a feathery breast speckled with red. I held on until there was nothing left to hang on to, and could only watch as short, paddled feet stepped out of the gore. The swan that burst from Penny walked awkwardly at first, but after a few steps, balanced on newfound feet. It looked up, and the giant swan, who nodded from up above. Penny's father was still trying to scream, but his strength was fading. His chest was a mess of flayed pectoral muscle, shifting organs, and a beating heart struggling to stay inside its ruined containment. I watched as the baby swan walked over to him, its dark eyes looking down thoughtfully, right before it dug into his chest. The beak was sharp, separating the tissue as it rooted around. Penny's father thrashed weakly, unable to defend himself. When the beak found his heart, it pinched and ripped it free, holding it up triumphantly before rearing back and dropping it down its throat. Arterial spray scattered in all directions, staining feathers and corn alike. When the baby was finished, it backed away from the corpse, the bulge of the heart still working its way down the throat. The giant swan reached down and gave an affectionate embrace. The sun burst through the tree line, and tantalizing pink and orange painted the sky. They stood there like sculptures, like masterpieces from carved diamonds that reflected the light of the sun. It was beautiful. When they were done, the swans looked at each other, then looked at me. The smaller one looked back at the mother and stood awkwardly, shuffling on its paddled feet. The mother scoffed and nudged the baby over to me. It walked hesitant at first, but eventually approached, its wings held bent in front of it. The mother turned and scooped up the rest of the father, gathering him up in one large, delicate bite. I looked at the small swan, then looked to what remained of Penny. Whatever was left was fading into the grass, withering away like ash on a campfire. I looked at the remains, feeling a ball in my throat and a heaviness in my chest. The swan reached out a wing and blocked my view of it, its dark eyes looking upset. It exhaled through its nasal passages in a way that felt sympathetic. I reached out for it, and it leaned against me, its long neck resting on my shoulder as its wings stretched out and wrapped around me. Through the blood and feathers, I felt the embrace of Penny, a kind soul meant for a better world. The swan whistled softly and I started to cry, throat-aching sobs I couldn't hold back. The swan hummed softly, swaying with me. We stood like this until my tears ran dry, and the swan pulled away to rejoin its mother. I wiped my eyes and watched her go, the haze of the sun lifting the weight of the pain I had gotten so used to ignoring. Together they stretched their wings, thousands of feathers casting shadows over the corn, and with one grand flap, they were gone. Ever since she was a kid, Penny dreamed of being a swan. It was a dream she had often, one I would get to know and love more every time she told it. She would tell me she dreamt of dancing among the stars, spreading her wings and flying across the sky. Up above would be a world free of pain and suffering, a world full of light that would shine so bright it would erase the pain of everything she'd been through. I'm older now, and things are much better than they used to be. I learned to have another family, one that won't have to know the pain of a broken home, and don't have to wonder if they belong. Sometimes I go out at night and look up at the stars. I think of Penny the swan, and if I look hard enough, I can see her flying with her mother. I used to take the kids to a pool at a state park. The lifeguard told me a creepy story. It was a nice pool, in-ground, concrete, and very well maintained. It was just in the middle of nowhere. It was on state park ground, surrounded by trees. The entire thing was very nicely done with a chain link fence all around it to discourage after-hours shenanigans. It's just the thing was in the middle of a forest. I have no idea what the planners were thinking, but it's free and the kids love it, so I guess who cares if it's in the middle of a forest, right? That's what I used to think. I took the kids one day and forgot to bring a book to read, so I was bored. There's only so long you can stare at kids splashing around in the pool. I don't know how the lifeguards do it. I guess that's why they take turns every hour or so. With boredom my only companion and absolutely nothing else to do but bake in the roasting sun, I decided to talk to the lifeguard who was on duty. I asked if she'd ever seen anything odd or unusual here at the pool. She took her eyes off the kids for just a moment to size me up. "Are you sure you really want to hear?" she said, turning her attention back to the swimmers. "Sure," I said. "Because once you hear, you won't be back," she said. I hesitated for a moment, then chuckled to myself, sizing her up. She was a thin girl that looked like she might just be out of high school, or maybe a year or two into college. I imagined there was some story of a party gone wrong or some kid that nearly drowned. In the back of my mind was the thought, what if she's playing me? I decided I was bored enough not to care, so I nodded. "Yes, I'm sure," I said. She leaned closer so that only I could hear the story she told, all the while watching the kids and never making eye contact with me. This was the story she told. "I've been a lifeguard here for 3 years during the summer to help pay my college bills. Since a lot of lifeguards come and go, it was easy to get to number 1 in seniority. I was the only one who was full-time and had some benefits, like insurance. Everyone else was part-time and came and went quite often. Lately, we've been having trouble keeping people. We've had to cut some of the pool hours. I couldn't be here 7 days a week, although my boss seemed to think I could. At first, I thought our dwindling workforce was due to the current worker shortage going on across the country. Why work here when you can find something better? But as time went on, I began to find out why they were really quitting this easy job. I always got to the pool first and did a walk around to make sure there was nothing broken. I picked up trash and generally made sure the pool was ready for guests. After that, I opened the lifeguard shack and tested the levels in the pool. One day I arrived a little earlier than usual, and to my great surprise, I found wet footprints leading from the pool to the fence. The pool stays uncovered at night and it's possible for someone to sneak in. However, in the 3 years I had worked here, no one ever had. As odd as this seemed, what was ever odder was the size of the prints. They were huge. I pulled out my phone and took some pictures before they dried out, and even took a shot of my foot next to the wet footprint. It was nearly twice the size of my foot. Now, I'm no basketball player. My foot is only a size 8 in women's, but still, twice my foot size didn't seem normal to me. In fact, this whole thing didn't seem normal. Why break into a pool to go swimming when the pool would be open in less than an hour? I shrugged it off and went about my daily routine. I opened the pool, and the people came in. No fuss, no muss. At the end of the day, I got another surprise. When I went to clean the filter, it was full of hair. Now, don't get me wrong, there are usually some odd things in the filter, and hair is not the oddest. I once found an eyeball floating in the filter. It was from a kid's stuffed animal, but still, it was pretty freaky to see it there. This hair seemed different. There's always hair in the filter, but this was longer and thicker. It was almost as if someone let a dog swim in the pool. Again, I shrugged it off and cleaned the filter, but I logged it in the back of my mind. The next day, the same thing happened. I made sure to get there a little early, and there were the wet footprints again. It was as if I had scared someone off by arriving early. But how would they get their dog over the fence? It was 8 feet tall. Was someone sneaking their pet orangutan in to go swimming before ours? Was a bear somehow getting in and taking a dip? The hair I found didn't seem right for a bear. I searched all around the fence looking for any spots where something had dug under and gotten in. There was nothing. I double-checked all the gates. They were secure, and there were no spots where anything could get in. Again, when I cleaned the filter, there were more hairs. I kept some out of curiosity. On my next day off, I drove to the college I attended and asked the professor if he could analyze the hair as a favor. He reluctantly agreed and told me it might be a few days. In the meantime, I was getting to work earlier every day. This mystery consumed me. I had to find out what was going on, not only for the cleanliness of the swimmers, but for my own sanity. No matter when I arrived, whatever, it seemed to know I was coming and got out just in time. I decided to change my strategy. I drove to work early but parked my car at a trailhead a mile away from the pool. It took me around 20 minutes to walk to the pool. I approached as quietly as possible. As I reached the rise where I could see the top of the fence, I could hear splashing. I kept coming until I could see the level of the water. At first, I didn't see anything. Then suddenly something exploded out of the water. It was massive and covered in long brown hair. It landed back in the water with a huge splash. I froze. I knew there was something, but until now the reality hadn't hit home yet. There was a creature swimming in the same pool I watched every day. I stood there, transfixed on this apparition as it frolicked in the water like a kid. It spouted water out of its mouth 20 feet in the air as it floated on its back. My mind kicked out of frozen terror mode just enough for me to pull out my cell phone and take a picture. Unfortunately, I'd forgotten to turn the volume down. When it made the lens click sound, the creature immediately snapped its attention to me. It glared at me for a long moment, causing my veins to turn to ice. I expected it to run away, startled, but it didn't. It slowly rose out of the water and stepped onto the concrete surrounding the pool. I know it stood at least as tall as the fence as it stepped toward me. I was too terrified to snap another picture as it hurdled the fence in one leap and landed 40 feet in front of me. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The relative safety of my car was a mile away. It might as well have been 100 miles. I knew there was no way I could outrun this thing. It flexed its claws as it continued its slow advance toward me, fangs bared. I knew I was about to die. It was close to 10 feet away. I could hear its breathing and smell the chlorine mixed with wet animal smell as the water dripped from its fur. And then it paused. It cocked its head, then gave me a look and disappeared into the forest. A few seconds later, a car drove by. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and started the long trek back to my car. Every step I took, I wondered if it was following me. Every sound I heard caused me to whip around and look to see if the monster was sneaking up behind me. It seemed to take forever to reach my car, and after the last quarter mile, I ran. I didn't think, I knew it was following me. When I dove into my car, I locked the door and called my boss. I told him I needed to take the day off. He said he didn't have anyone to cover for me. If I took off, the pool would have to stay closed until my relief came in 4 hours. I fought a hard battle between my fears and my responsibilities. I reluctantly drove to the pool and opened it. Everything I normally did, all of my daily routine, took on an element of a horror movie. Every blind corner I felt like I was about to be attacked. Every time I was out in the open, I could feel eyes on me. When people came, I felt a little better having company. But as I scanned the swimmers to make sure they were safe, I would constantly scan the trees for this monster to see if I was safe. I wondered if it would attack even with the swimmers there. My mind wandered to the movie Jaws. All the swimmers in the ocean were blissfully ignorant that they were about to be a meal for a malevolent creature. I wondered if my swimmers were about to share the same fate. When my shift finally, mercifully ended, I felt like I had been put through the ringer. As I drove home, my attention was divided between the road and the image of that monster slowly approaching me. claws out, snarling. I didn't even see the truck that blindsided me. I woke up in the hospital with machines beeping and tubes running in and out of me. The doctor told me how lucky I was, that my injuries weren't that bad, and I should be out of the hospital in a few days. I called the professor and asked him what he had found out about the hairs. He seemed hesitant and told me he would rather tell me in person. A few hours later, he visited me in my hospital room. He said that he couldn't match the hairs with any known animal, but when he contacted some lesser-known sources, they came up with an answer. I didn't really want to have my suspicions confirmed, but I needed to know for sure. He said it could be a Bigfoot. I pulled out my phone and showed him my picture of the creature. He took it and studied it. He zoomed up and scanned through the image like a kid that had found $100. He asked if I could send him a copy of it. When I agreed, he was so excited I thought he would jump into my hospital bed and kiss me. Knowing what was hunting me didn't make it any better. In fact, now I knew no one would believe me. The professor even said I should be careful who I tell. After he left, I called my boss. He never asked me how I was, only when I could get back to work. When I told him I quit, he nearly blew a gasket. He screamed at me that it was my fault he had to close the pool, and informed me that if I quit, the insurance wouldn't pay for my hospital stay. So I was trapped. I had to go back to the pool of terror and possibly face that thing. I had no desire to ever go back, but I had no choice. So back I went. 2 days after I was released from the hospital, I was due for my first shift of opening the pool. I made sure I didn't go early. I knew this thing existed and I had no intention of trying to sneak up on it again. I was ready to live and let life. Unfortunately, it had other plans. I saw it more often, peeking out from behind trees, watching me as I watched the swimmers. When I closed the pool and walked back to my car is when I could especially feel its eyes on me. I practically ran to my car, slammed the door, and got out of there as fast as I could. I made sure my attention was focused on the road even though my eyes kept darting to the sides of the road. The following day, I came to work a few minutes early and stopped at the ranger station on the way in. I told them what was happening, and they laughed me out of the building. The professor had told me to expect it, but it was still hard seeing people I talked to and had grown to trust turn their back on me like that. I saw the creature again that day in the trees glaring at me, but did my best to ignore it. When I got home, I was mentally and physically exhausted. My stress level was through the roof. I'd started taking pills to help me sleep because this thing was in my dreams as well. That evening, as I tried to relax, I heard a commotion outside. I stepped out to find my trash cans knocked over, not an uncommon occurrence since I live on the outskirts of town. But this time when I went out to pick them up, it was there. It stood there much the same as the first day I discovered it, snarling and flexing its claws. I stood there, mind froze in fear, wondering at this dreadful apparition that stood before me. When it took its first step toward me, my fight or flight mode kicked in. I ran inside and locked the door. Then I called the police and told them someone was trying to break into my house. The monster helped corroborate my story by breaking a window while I was on the phone. I ran upstairs and hid in my bedroom closet. For a long time, there was a dreadful silence. What was it doing? Was it toying with me? And then I heard it. I could hear its massive footsteps as a dull thud on my carpet. I heard it slowly searching for me. It went all through the downstairs, and then I heard footsteps coming upstairs. I could hear them slowly, methodically working their way toward my bedroom. They came into my room. I could hear them walk around my bed and then over to the closet door. For a long moment, it did nothing, just stood there. I could hear my breathing turn rapid. I could feel the sweat run down my cheeks. I could picture the end of my life in bloody, gory detail. The door swung open and I screamed. "Ma'am, it's all right," I heard. I opened my eyes to see the police officer standing in front of me. I blinked hard to make sure he was real, then threw myself into his arms. He held me for a moment, then pulled me away. "Are you all right?" he asked. I couldn't answer. My mouth wouldn't work. It took me a few minutes to be able to form a few words. "Is it gone?" I didn't see anyone, and I searched the whole house. I nodded automatically, not really hearing what he was saying. He said the only thing they could do was patrol the area more often. He left shortly after, leaving me to my terrified self. There was no way I'd be sleeping anytime soon. I stayed up all night watching movies, mostly comedies, anything but horror. When the time rolled around for me to go to work, I wasn't up to it. I called the boss and told him I was sick, but he wasn't having it. He demanded I come to work anyway. I got an extra large coffee on the way to work that day, wondering how I was going to stay alert enough to watch for swimmers. When I got there, the answer was already provided for me. As I started my daily routine, eyes darting to the trees, I saw there was something floating in the pool. It took every ounce of courage I had not to run to my car and never return. I slowly approached it and saw it was a deer, at least what was left of one. Its throat had been slashed and blood hovered in the water around its body. What was even more disturbing was there was a drawing on the concrete. I approached and looked at the drawing. I immediately covered my mouth and backed away. It was a star with a circle around it and it was drawn using the deer's blood. I snapped a picture with my phone and sent it to my boss. He replied, "Very funny." I told him it wasn't a joke. I took pictures of the deer in the water and sent him those as well. He accused me of doing it so I wouldn't have to work that day. I shrugged it off, nearly telling him who, or should I say what, was responsible. He told me to wait where I was and not to open the pool. I put the closed sign out and covered up the pentagram with a tarp. When people started showing up to swim, I apologized and told them we were closed for repairs. A few asked me what repairs and I told them it was a filter problem and should be cleared up soon. When the boss arrived, he was beyond livid. He walked around looking at the deer and the blood in total disbelief. He screamed at me that the pool would have to be completely drained and cleaned. He threatened to make me pay for it. I told him I had nothing to do with it and if he tried to blame me, I would call the police and press charges for harassment. That seemed to settle him down a little. He told me to try to get the blood off the concrete while he started the process of draining the pool. Scrubbing did next to nothing. I found an old pressure washer that we used to clean the buildings and tried it. That seemed to work and pleased the boss that he wouldn't have to pay to have it sandblasted. All this time, I kept an eye on the woods, looking for my hairy stalker. At times, I caught glimpses of him as I cleaned up the mess I knew he had left. I wondered at the ramifications of him killing the deer and making the symbol. I wondered if he knew what he was doing. After a long day of cleaning and listening to the boss griping, I finally got into my car, exhausted. As I drove home, I saw the monster on the side of the road. I was tempted to run it over but didn't think my car would survive it. As I was about to pass him, I saw him holding a deer by its neck and legs. To my horror, he threw the deer at my car. Time slowed as I had no time to react. Instead of hitting the brakes, my foot slipped off the brake pedal and hit the gas. It turned out to be a good accident. The deer hit the back of my car instead of the front. I truly believe he was aiming at my windshield. I didn't dare stop. I kept driving. Only once I got home did I check the damage. There was quite a dent in the rear of my car behind the passenger door, but it was still drivable. I believe if I had hit the brakes, it would have totaled my car or gone right through the windshield and killed me. I shuddered at the thought of this monster actively trying to kill me. I wondered what I had done to deserve death in the eyes of this creature. I thought back to the first time I saw the footprints. I replayed everything that had happened. It struck me that he had seen me take pictures of him and that seemed to anger him. I thought of a radical idea. It was stupid and I didn't think it would work. But it was something to try rather than having this monster stalking me the rest of my life. I drove out to the pool early the next morning. It was strange seeing it empty. I don't think I've ever seen the bottom of the pool so clean. I stood on the concrete beside the pool and held up my phone. The picture I had taken of the creature was on the screen. I saw it come out of the woods and leap the fence, landing right in front of me. I tried not to show how very frightened I really was. He looked at me, then at the phone. I took it as a good sign that his fangs weren't bared. I set the phone on the ground and backed away. He reached down and picked it up, looking at the picture for a long moment, then turned and leaped over the fence, disappearing into the woods. "Wow, that was some story," I said. "You should write fiction." "That was great. You want to know the best part?" She said never take her eyes off my kids swimming in the pool. "Sure." She leaned a little closer and whispered, "It's true." I smiled and rolled my eyes. "Sure it is," I said. "I'll tell you what," she said. "Why don't you look over my right shoulder into the tree line and tell me what you see?" I did as she asked, grinning at the joke this lifeguard was playing on me when suddenly my smile faltered. I saw something in the trees. It was a brown head peeking around a tree. At first, I thought it was a coworker in on the joke, but the head was over 8 feet tall. Its eyes bored into mine and narrowed. I found myself looking away despite myself. When I looked back, it was gone. "Something wrong," she said. How long ago was the pool reopened?" I said. "Last week." I looked around and over in the corner on the concrete I could see the faintest outline of a star. My eyes grew wide. "Welcome to my world," she said without the slightest hint of humor. I whipped around toward the pool. "Come on, kids, we're leaving," I called out. "Aw, Dad, we haven't even been here an hour. Why do we have to go?" I looked at the lifeguard and then glanced up into the trees. "It's not safe," I said. I loaded up the car with 3 disgruntled kids and started home. On the way, I kept glancing into the woods. I swear I saw the woods glance back. The feelings you have when you're alone are valid. I realized what was happening when my socks were out of place. I keep them lined up in Roy G. Biv order in my second drawer from the top. My neuroses make me happy, and I don't care if that's weird. Yesterday, green was in between red and orange. I would never do that. It explained the missing food, the stale cigarette odor in my room, and a handful of other things that don't make sense when someone lives alone. I think the worst part was understanding the feeling of being watched while alone in my bedroom. The closet is directly behind me when I'm sitting at the desk. It's the only place he could have been hiding. The fucker should have remembered that I'm a chem major. He'd been watching me long enough. The sulfuric acid was easy to get. Sodium cyanide was trickier, but I have a key to the lab and no one comes in on Fridays. The setup required a bucket and a piece of string slid through the crack in my closet door. At first, I wasn't sure if tonight would be the night, but I'd been sitting at my desk for just 19 minutes when I felt him. The closet door was 13 feet behind me, yet the space felt full, like two people were in my tiny bedroom. I couldn't ignore the feeling once it was running through me. Imagine your ears hurting as you sink deeper into the bottom of a pool without knowing which way is up. I wanted to run out of the room, but the door is right next to the closet, so I tipped the dresser on its side. It crashed against the closet door at a 45-degree angle, with the edge catching itself on torn carpet. There was no way for anyone inside the closet to open the door. Hand trembling, I grabbed the string. This isn't real, I told myself. There's no way a man is trapped inside my room. I heard a gasp from the other side of the door when I pulled the string. I stayed away from my apartment for 6 hours before realizing that I had to return. What would I tell the police? That I stole chemicals needed to make a poison gas? That I might have killed someone? No, I had to return on my own. The living room felt off when I opened the door, but it was too dark for me to see anything. I carefully closed and locked it behind me. For a moment, nothing moved. I told myself that I was being ridiculous, that the feeling of pressure in an empty room was just my own neurons playing a trick on themselves. I sighed and turned on the light. The dead man was surrounded by his own vomit. I could see my dresser pushed neatly against the wall in my bedroom. He had gotten out with just enough life left in him to convulse his way into the next room. My world swirled when I recognized him as the Dean of Student Affairs. His uncle was the college president, and the family had a stupid amount of money, more than enough to make problems like me disappear, assuming I didn't get charged for the homicide I had absolutely committed. I squatted on the rug, trying to control my breathing, failing to control my breathing. I just killed a man. Consciousness threatened to run away from me as I swayed on my feet. That's when I saw the note on the floor. I didn't think before acting. My brain felt far away. I grabbed it and read, "I moved your dresser back into place for you, smiling face. With him gone, it's just the two of us in your apartment now." Billy's game. Billy, a skinny boy, perked up at Mrs. May's call. "Be a good boy and take care of Henry on his first day, would you?" "Sure thing, Mrs. M." The kid, Billy, stood and extended a hand to me in greeting. He gestured to the vacant desk beside us and I gratefully sank into the attached seat. So far, the boarding school had a completely different vibe to the public one I was accustomed to. There was no jeering or obvious bullying, and perhaps the most jarring of all, everyone listened to the teachers with respect. Billy himself was all smiles and somehow managed to bring my rampant nerves under control with an infectious enthusiasm. I couldn't see how anyone could possibly think him lame or weird, so I immediately had him pegged as a popular kid even despite his grubby appearance. As if to prove my point, one of the bigger kids draped an arm over Billy's shoulders. "Hey, new kid." He addressed me with a wave. "It was Henry, right? Nice to meet you. My name's Johnny, but my friends call me JJ. I eked out a greeting, trying my best to sound cool and laid back. I seemed to have done all right because JJ smiled before turning to Billy. "You looking forward to the game later, Bill?" Billy grinned from ear to ear. "You bet I am. Are you part of a team or something?" I asked. JJ ruffled Billy's sandy hair. "Are you kidding? He's the star player." Everyone within earshot laughed at that, so I thought it best to laugh along with them, not wanting to seem like I didn't get the joke. "See you out there." JJ returned to his seat. A few minutes before the bell was set to ring for lunch, Mrs. May dismissed Billy and I. "You ought to have a head start since it's your first day," she told me. We grabbed our bags and slung them over our shoulders, but as I got up to leave I noticed an abrupt change in atmosphere. The room was deathly silent. I paused at the door and stole a glance back. There wasn't a soul in the classroom that wasn't staring intently at Billy's back. If he noticed, he hid it well. He was already walking briskly down the hall and whistling the tune of some upbeat theme song. I caught up and asked him about the stairs. "Oh, you'll see," he said as we walked. "They're just impatient is all." Billy showed me around the cafeteria and even offered up some tips and tricks to get extra food out of the dinner ladies. When the bell rang and a storm of shoes echoed through the corridors, he led me to the edge of a huge field at the rear of the school. "Come on, I'll show you where we play the game." He called back to me as he jogged up ahead. Whatever this game was, he seemed very excited to play. I had my fingers crossed for soccer. We came to a stop at the center of the field. At our feet lay a length of blue tarp held in place with bricks that sat on each of its corners. I couldn't make out any markings to indicate a playing field of any kind, so I assumed that Billy's game must have something to do with the misshapen lump concealed beneath the tarp. He crouched and cleared the heavy bricks from the two nearest corners before throwing back the cover to reveal a porcelain doll about the size of your average preschooler. It was adorned with a patchy jumble of mismatched clothes, and I couldn't help but admire the artistry of its detail. Though I found the gentle smile to be somewhat unsettling, it was impossible to deny its objective beauty. Footsteps vibrating up though the dirt wrenched me from my stupor. I turned to see what must have been every student in attendance rushing toward us as one gargantuan unit. "Seriously," I said, intimidated by the sight. "What is this game?" Billy seemed giddy with anticipation as he took the doll carefully in his arms and held it out in the direction of the stampeding crowd. "I do hope you join in." JJ headed the pack. As soon as he stepped into range, he wrapped both hands around the doll's neck and tore it from Billy's grasp, throwing it hard against the ground. I shouted in protest and tried to wedge myself in between JJ and the doll, but a dozen kids had already circled the pair. I was aghast. What madness could have driven him to ruin a thing as intricate as that? Through gaps in the crowd, I watched the barbaric scene unfold. JJ repeatedly brought his foot down on the defenseless doll with a primal glee in his eyes, and the spectators drunk in the meaningless violence with a hunger. A younger girl broke free of the circling spectators with a sharpened pencil raised to the sky. She swung it in a downward arc, burying it straight into the doll's painted eyeball. I was shocked to see something dark and red gushing freely from the wound. The way the doll reacted to the blows didn't sit right with me either. It was a doll, of that I was sure, but from afar I could have easily been fooled. I'd seen enough. I spun away from the sickening sight and fought back bile as I picked my way through the crazed horde, scanning the horizon for a teacher. I finally spotted Mrs. May's tight gray bun bobbing in the distance, and waved my arms to grab her attention. "Over here." She paid me no mind as she shot by, bullet a path through the onlookers, and promptly stamped her boot heel into the doll's nose, shattering its head like a coconut. My bag slipped from my shoulder as cheers filled the air. The game continued for a while longer, though I couldn't see much of it after the gap carved by Mrs. May quickly filled. When the crowd finally dispersed, the doll was nothing more than a pile of torn clothes and a chunky red splatter staining the grass. JJ paused when he reached me, panting lightly as if from a brief workout. "You have to try it out tomorrow. I know, it's weird at first, but just trust me." I flinched as he patted me on the back and left. A disheveled Mrs. May approached next. "Don't worry, Henry." She smiled in a way that I'm sure she thought was comforting. "Billy will work his magic and it'll all be right as rain in the morning. You'll have plenty more chances. Come on, let's head back." I wanted to tear free of the vice-like grip she maintained on my upper arm, but I wasn't confident enough in my ability to scale the spiked fence in time. Billy was the only one who lingered on the field. He scurried across the blood-soaked ground collecting fragments of the doll and throwing them into a plastic bag. I assumed the doll had been his, but he didn't seem at all disappointed by its brutal demise. The rest of the day passed in a disorienting blur. Everyone I met was painfully nice to me. There wasn't a single altercation to speak of, and no one mentioned what happened at lunch. Billy didn't return to lessons, and when night fell I found myself staring up at the dark mattress above me, half doubting he'd existed at all. He should have occupied one of the countless beds that lined the sprawling dormitory, but as far as I could tell he wasn't there either. The only thing I knew for certain anymore was that I needed a way out. I sent my parents a frantic text begging them to pick me up, careful to keep my excuses vague. Despite the late hour, their reply came quick. "Nice try, sport, but you're not getting out of boarding school that easily. We've been through this a million times. You need to learn some discipline. These guys will straighten you out and make you into a proper young man. Treat everyone with respect, listen well in class, and we'll see you in 6 weeks. Okay, we love you, son." A sudden voice cut through the darkness, and the fright it gave sent the phone spinning from my hands. "We're not supposed to be on our phones after lights out," someone informed me politely. Tears stung my eyes as I rolled onto my side, feigning sleep for the remainder of the night and dreading the approaching dawn. I found Billy sitting at his desk the next morning with a familiar doll propped up in his lap. A few additional patches had been stitched into its miniature clothes, but aside from that there wasn't a blemish to be seen on its polished skin. The others lined up to take turns complimenting Billy on his expert craftsmanship. JJ was practically drooling when he stepped up, Again, Mrs. May dismissed Billy and I before the bell rang, and again I felt my heart plummet as the students swarmed the lifelike doll to smash its smiling face in. It only took one spark for the kids to fall upon the doll like a shoal of feasting piranha. JJ jammed a ballpoint pen between its shoulder blades in the middle of class one day, and the ensuing bloodbath led to the entire class being evacuated to a new room for the rest of the day. Except for Billy anyway. He did what he always did and stayed behind to clean up the mess. The ruthless brutality of it all was forever playing on a loop in my head. Whether to blink or sleep, whenever my eyes closed I saw all the ways they pulled and clawed and hammered away at that thing. It was like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Yesterday, JJ held it in position in front of me. "Come on," he urged. "Just press your thumbs in its eyes real quick. It'll feel amazing." The doll lolled limp in his arms as I refused him once again. Every day they grow more insistent. It's as if they're offended by my lack of enthusiasm, and I'm terrified of what might happen if I keep turning them down. I can feel their eyes on me even as I type this in my bunk. Tomorrow might be the last chance they give me, but the very prospect is tearing me apart. I feel like once I cross that threshold there'll be no turning back. I'll be a monster, same as them. So please, I'm begging anyone who reads this, talk me out of it. Bachelorette party regret. Told my maid of honor, Melanie, that I wanted my bachelorette to be an out-of-town weekend, preferably next to the beach with some nightlife. That was all I asked for, pretty simple and straightforward, or so I thought. Melanie said she'll try to make it happen, and after 3 months, when I asked her how the planning was going, she told me she was having a hard time getting PTO. I asked her how that could be when she had months to get those PTOs, but instead of answering my question, she said she would rather just do a night out on town. It was a huge disappointment, but what I could do. I had spent almost $1,000 on Melanie's bachelorette 2 years ago, a 4-day weekend in Charleston. Not a cheap place, because that's what she asked for. I almost got fired from my job because I had used up all my PTOs to travel for her bridal shower and dress appointments. And that's not counting the bach and the wedding itself. And I broke a finger helping her with centerpieces and decorations. I loved that girl. She was my bestie, my ride or die, and for her to be like, "Oh, I can't get PTO for my bach," that's so bullshit. I know friendships aren't tit for tat, but I couldn't help feeling bitter. I seriously planned on telling Melanie I didn't want the batch anymore, but then I knew Edmund, my fiance, whose amazing friends were taking him to Vegas for 4 days, would ask me why I wasn't getting a bachelorette. Edmund had about 1 million friends who would do anything for him, as he never failed to remind me. He's a great guy otherwise, but he also had this high school mentality towards life. He could make me feel like such a loser sometimes. So I went, and it was pathetic. There were only the two of us, me and Melanie. She bought me a couple of rounds of drinks, I got drunk, and we went back to my house for some pizza. Edmund too had just gotten back from game night with some coworkers. As I went to wash my face, I heard Melanie make small talk with him and I heard them laughing. She was making more of an effort with him than she had made with me on my own bachelorette party. It was the kind of thing that happened all the time. People would be preoccupied and sullen with me, but the minute Edmund appeared on the scene, they came alive. It was nothing personal. Edmund just had that effect on people. But at that moment, on that night, it stung. Anyway, the week after my so-called bachelorette, Edmund was going to Vegas with his 10 groomsmen for his bachelor party. They all chipped in for him to fly first class and he didn't have to pay a dime for his accommodations, which was at one of the nicest hotels on the strip. Edmund couldn't stop talking about all the stuff the guys were doing for him and how grateful he was to have them as friends. Like, I'm happy he's happy, but coming on the heels of my pathetic little bachelorette, I wished he would shut up. He could be so annoying sometimes. I was so relieved when he finally left for Vegas. And now here comes the kicker. Melanie's husband James was Edmund's best man. The first night Edmund was in Vegas, he texted me and said he was having a great time. But, he said, he didn't know that Melanie was going to be there too. He and James were going to share a hotel room, but Melanie insisted on staying with James. So Edmund now had to room up with another groomsman. So at least now I knew why Melanie couldn't save her PTOs for my bachelorette. She had planned on going to Vegas with the boys. Friday night, Edmund told me Melanie was tagging along to their every single activity, basically super glued to James' side and acting extremely irrationally whenever approached by anything remotely female. Edmund was getting super annoyed, and he said James was beyond pissed. He told Edmund Melanie could be a lot sometimes, and he tried to apologize for what Melanie was doing. He would have said more, but Melanie came up to them. Edmund said he and James didn't have 10 whole seconds alone together the entire trip. I said all the groomsmen were sick and tired of Melanie glowering menacingly at anything with breasts. who dared to walk within 5 feet of her husband. The groomsmen weren't there to be raunchy, but Melanie made it seem like they would all rush into the nearest brothel the moment she took her eyes off of them. Sunday morning, Edmund told me shit hit the fan, bad. He was going to James and Melanie's room when he heard James talking inside. He heard him shouting but couldn't catch the exact words. Edmund knocked and the door opened so fast it was like James had been standing at the door the entire time. Edmund said he looked like he was going to kill somebody. Edmund tried to play it off like everything was fine, but James was in a trance or something. He was staring at Edmund and his hands were gripping the door so hard the knuckles were white. Edmund was seriously concerned about Melanie now. He didn't think James would hurt her, but he felt like he had to make sure. So it was a huge relief to him when Melanie came up behind James, very calm, very much in control like. She put her hand on James' arm and pulled him back into the room and closed the door in Edmund's face. While all this was going down in Vegas at Edmund's bachelor's party, I start hearing from my 3 other bridesmaids that Melanie had asked each of them to Venmo her $700 for my bachelorette trip. But then Melanie had gone radio silent after they had sent the money. And now they were wondering what the plans were exactly, and also they were hearing from their SOs, some of whom were Edmund's groomsmen, that Edmund had told them I had already had my bachelorette. I told them I did not know about the money, and that it was true Melanie had already threw me the bachelorette, which was just the 2 of us going out to drink. I told them as far as I knew there was nothing else getting planned from Melanie's end. Trust that I struggled to give Melanie the benefit of the doubt. There was the slight possibility Melanie had a surprise batch planned for me down the line. But after everything that's happened, I doubted it. Sunday afternoon, I called Edmund to let him know I was coming to Vegas. I couldn't reach him, which wouldn't be concerning under normal circumstances, but I had a weird feeling about literally everything now. I called James and then Melanie, but they weren't answering either. I called one of the other groomsmen, and he told me he hadn't seen Edmund since Sunday morning. I got to Vegas on the last flight out and took a taxi to the casino hotel where they were staying. The groomsman Edmund was sharing a room with told me where James and Melanie's room was. It was one of the penthouse suites originally James had planned to share with Edmund. I went there and knocked on the door. Nobody answered. I counted to 5 and knocked again. I knew in my heart there was no one in there, but I didn't know what else to do. When James answered the door, he looked as shocked to see me as I was to see him. I asked him if he had seen Edmund, and he said no, and that he was actually wondering if I had seen Edmund. Where's Melanie? I asked him. Haven't seen her either, he said. After a little pause, he said, the last time I saw her, she was with Edmund. My stomach dropped. Are you saying the last time you saw them, they were together? James' face underwent a subtle change, as if he had just realized what I just realized. He pulled me inside the room saying, we have to talk. I felt like I was going to start crying. Melanie was beautiful and outgoing, and it was only natural she and Edmund would be attracted to each other. Whenever I saw them together, I always thought to myself how strange it was that Edmund was with me instead of her. But Melanie was also my best friend, and I had never imagined that she would betray me. James put his arms around me, and I leaned into his embrace, tears running down my face. I was bawling by now with my face mashed into his chest. It wasn't just Edmund and Melanie running off together anymore. It was everything that was wrong with my life. But even as I was bawling my eyes out because my best friend had ran off with my fiancé, a superficial part of me was marveling at how absolutely posh this hotel room was. It was a level of luxury I had only seen on Google Images, which was why I noticed the stain on the floor next to the bed, as if somebody had spilled a cup of water there. The stain was so out of place in all that over-the-top luxuriousness that it was screaming to be noticed. It seemed very wrong to me, but I didn't know why. James' arms tightened around me as he nuzzled the top of my head. He held me so hard that I could hardly breathe, and then he started massaging my back, crossing the not-so-subtle line between counseling and creeping. James was the type to hit on everything that moves. He was a shit human being, and Melanie deserved so much better. I didn't blame her for leaving him, but did it have to be with my fiancé? I told him to stop and he backed off pretty quickly, but I didn't like the way he kept looking at me, as if I was a thing instead of a person. It gave me the creeps, so I let my hair down so he couldn't see my face or where I was looking. And as I grilled him on the events of the last couple of days in as normal a tone of voice as I could muster, another part of my mind kept getting drawn back to the stain on the carpet. Mind you, it wasn't anything special. It was just a water stain. But in my frame of mind, that stain came to symbolize all the sinister forces in the universe that were conspiring to ruin my life. And as the minutes passed, I noticed, or imagined that I noticed, that the stain had gotten slightly bigger. I didn't know what I was frightened of, but I was more scared than I had ever been in my life. And the whole time my mouth was still on autopilot, going on and on about Melanie and Edmund running off together. James would grunt now and then, but he was obviously bored of the subject. Finally, I told him I needed to get drunk and asked him to go with me to the bar downstairs. As we were leaving the room, I saw Edmund coming down from the other end of the hall towards us. It was a long hallway and James hadn't seen him yet. As the door closed behind us, I put my hands in James' pants pockets where I saw him put the room card key while whispering into his ear what I wanted him to do to me that night. James was such a freak about sex that it made him stupid sometimes. The moment the door closed and I had the card key so James couldn't get back into the room, I ran towards Edmund, who was now also running towards me. I had no idea why I was running and I didn't stop to ask myself why. I ran as if for my life. I didn't look back, but I could feel James behind me. Just as his hand grabbed onto a chunk of my hair, I took a sort of flying leap into Edmund's arms. As Edmund pushed me away from James' path, I saw the knife in James' hands as he came for Edmund. There was the sound of a shot, which in an enclosed hallway is simply deafening. What followed was the total silence one typically only experiences underwater. James collapsed like a puppet whose master had let go of the strings. I looked behind him and saw Melanie standing there with a gun in her hand. There was blood on her face and her hair. Her clothes were torn and she was covered in bruises all over her body. She put the gun carefully on the floor and collapsed into my arms. Below is what Melanie and Edmund told me happened during the bachelor party and the months leading up to it. I hope it makes sense. James had been unemployed for the last 6 months, and Melanie said he blamed Edmund. James and Edmund used to work for the same company until James was laid off, and Edmund got promoted to James' old position. Somehow or the other, James convinced himself that he had lost his job because of Edmund. Melanie knew something was off when James emptied out their joint account to pay for Edmund's bachelor's party, so she decided to use her PTOs to go to Vegas and keep an eye on James. Because she had barely any money left, she decided to ask my bridesmaids to Venmo her cash for an out-of-town bachelorette party which she pretended to still be planning. In Vegas, Melanie took on the role of the toxic jealous partner so James wouldn't guess her real reason for being there. By the third day, James' frustration had reached boiling point. He would rant non-stop to her about how Edmund was a backstabbing bitch who ruined his life. Melanie tried to talk him down, but James wasn't having it. She still didn't know what James had in mind. She thought he might just be letting off steam, and maybe she was the paranoid and delusional one. But then she found a gun in their hotel room. She knew she couldn't keep him away from Edmund forever, so she told Edmund everything and warned him to stay away from James. Edmund said he didn't know whether to believe her or not. To him, it all sounded like crazy talk. Even Melanie herself wasn't sure, and she agreed with Edmund that James might have had the gun for legitimate reasons. To appease Melanie, Edmund agreed to go on a trip to the desert surrounding Vegas with another groomsman. Melanie told them to keep the trip a secret from the other groomsmen so James wouldn't find out. This was Sunday afternoon, and there was no cell phone connection in the desert where they went, so I couldn't reach Edmund when I called him. When James couldn't find Edmund, he figured out that Melanie had tipped him off and that her whole reason for coming to Vegas was to stop him from hurting Edmund. In his rage, he started hitting her. She lost consciousness. When I knocked on the door, he must have pushed her under the bed and then answered the door. He had probably hoped or expected it would be Edmund. In the meantime, while they were in the desert, Edmund's groomsman Kevin let it slip that he was surprised James went all out like this for his bachelors, so he guessed James must not be pissed at him anymore. Edmund got the whole story out of Kevin and it matched what Melanie had told him, that James blamed him for losing his job. Edmund knew then that Melanie was right, and he guessed, correctly, that Melanie herself would now be in danger. He drove back to the hotel and arrived there just as James and I came out of the room into the hallway. That stain I saw next to the bed. Melanie had peed while she was passed out, and then she had peed again, causing the stain to grow larger. When I got James out of the room, Melanie had regained consciousness and knew she had to find James and stop him. She got the gun he had left in the hotel room and shot him just as he was attacking Edmund with the knife. Melanie said she would pay the bridesmaids back, but Edmund and I insisted we would have that covered. It was the least we could do for her. I made Melanie move in with Edmund and me because she could no longer afford the mortgage on her salary alone. James had also ran up various credit cards behind her back and basically fucked over her finances for the next 2 years. When Melanie got a promotion at work that came with a big raise and better PTO, she and the original bridesmaid squad took me to Miami. It wasn't a bachelorette party because I was married by then, but we still did all the bachelorette things. We wore matching pink outfits, had a scavenger hunt, played board games, and annoyed strangers with our silly antics. So I ended up getting my dream bachelorette after all, and I didn't even have to plan another wedding to get it. Thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed these stories, then hit the like. See you guys next time.